you've got a little spot, say you get sugar, 3 welds down the primary, and it might be okay strength wise, but if a little piece of that sugar breaks off and goes into the turbine housing, that's bad news. And, then you get a customer calling you upset that you blew the turbo up and everything else. So prep is very, very important.
Welcome to the HPA Tune-In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Riley Stair from RS Motorsport. Now, Riley first got onto my radar, as I imagine he's done for a lot of people on Instagram, thanks to his insane tube chassis, 1,000 horsepower, 10,000 RPM, 1970 Pontiac Trans Am. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but this thing is absolutely insane and can't help but turn heads. He's used this essentially as a rolling business card for his fabrication business, RS Motorsport, and it's a pretty effective one. The fabrication work on this car is absolutely second to none. Despite this build essentially being of show car level, Riley's also not afraid to really put it through its paces out on the racetrack, which is essentially exactly what he built it for. Riley's also got a very interesting and unusual backstory in that he was for a number of years a professional BMX racer. At the end, he kind of decided that the risk to his body and the amount of crashes he was taking just wasn't going to be worth it anymore, and he transitioned his skill sets into fabrication. And on that note, he is essentially completely self-taught as well, which just goes to show that if you want something bad enough, you can absolutely make it happen. This is a fairly deep and wide-ranging chat with Riley. We talk about his backstory. We also talk about founding RS Motorsport, how he's developing that, the vision that he has for the future, and of course we dive deep into some of the topics on fabrication itself, specifically the welding process, TIG welding, and some of the key elements when it comes to preparing your workpiece prior to welding. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tune-In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Riley. Thanks for joining us today. And as always, let's start by learning a little bit about your background, specifically how you developed an interest in cars.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, I grew up basically around old American stuff. My dad, working class family. So dad always had, something that, to be completely honest, they're usually, some sort of shit that he had to drive to work, but old 80s Camaros, late 70s trucks, that sort of thing. And I guess my first memory of something cool was that he had a Chevy Love with a little 327 in it that we went and did burnouts up and down the street in. And that was the first turn my brain on and pinged me that I like that, so I guess that's where it started. And then, tinkering around with him, like so many of us, tinkering around with him in the garage and handing wrenches and holding the light and all that stuff, and it just grew from there. And now I can't stop.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sickness that I think everyone listening to this podcast probably also suffers from. But Could be definitely worse. So over this time, it sounds like you're sort of honing some skills on a mechanical level as well.
Yeah. I mean, back then we're definitely, he's having to fix stuff basically to go to work kind of thing, because they're all, you know, like I said, old 70s, 80s stuff. So
Not the most reliable, perhaps.
no, definitely not. And when money's tight, you got to fix it yourself so you can go to work, try and make more money. So, doing stuff like fixing his old trucks, doing little things here and there, lift kits, pull one engine out, put another one in. It's all small block Chevy stuff. So, and then, mom's Ford Windstar blows up and you got to put a motor in that. So I'm kind of growing up around that and learning the basics of how to take something apart and put it back together.
Sure. Obviously, with your Pontiac Trans Am, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, you're racing that in road race applications. So how did that sort of interest in cars actually move more towards a traditional motorsport scenario?
Well, I grew up traditional mechanic stuff with him, and then moving from there, I moved into a different thing entirely. Always been into, I guess, competition, so to speak. Played soccer, and then moved that into like always enjoyed riding bicycles, and rode bikes. And then we went to a BMX track and ended up doing that for a lot of years. And that gets into a whole, I guess, history of life. But always ended up in the racing competitive, that's kind of what I was drawn towards. And, as you get older and you're allowed to drive cars and work on cars and start trying to get a little money together, and you end up building cars and that end up being performance based, and kind of the next, I guess, natural progression is to try and get it on the track and start, hammering it around the track.
I'm interested what drew you towards road racing as opposed to perhaps drag racing?
So I guess in full disclosure, I love drag racing. It's like if you went on, my YouTube search history, it's probably mostly drag racers. I love both. And I think realistically, the access was a lot of it. So, part of the inspiration for my car, my Trans Am, the engine package and stuff like that was drag race driven. I've always loved the extremes of everything. And, if you want to go fast in a straight line from dead stop to, however fast you get going, that's drag racing, right? So most extreme version. But as far as access goes, and then as far as something that kind of catered towards something I was more familiar with BMX racing was definitely road racing. It's a course, and there's a lot that I think in kind of muscle memory, so to speak, transfers over, having to navigate corners and pick a line and all that stuff, And so that kind of drew me to that initially, and then still look at drag racing stuff, draw inspiration from it and everything else, certain parts of builds. But as far as access and then familiarity, as far as trying to get around a road course, was always super intriguing to me.
I've sort of gone from initially racing karts when I was younger and then doing some hill climb stuff and then absolutely nothing because I didn't have a budget to do it. And then when I started my business, I went into drag racing because as a tuner and an engine builder, to me, that was the ultimate test of your engine and your tuning, which still I think holds true. I think most people also probably think that drag racing's a pretty boring form of sport. I mean, you put the throttle to the floor and go fast in a straight line for 400 meters. And, when you're running maybe 12-second passes, yeah, it's probably not overly taxing, but once you sort of get down into the 7s, 8s and 9s, the cars start moving around, and there is actually a bit of skill in it. But then now that I live probably 1,500 miles away from a decent drag strip, we've sort of gravitated back towards road racing, and what I really do like about it is a very different skill set, obviously, but also you get a hell of a lot more seat time for your money than drag racing. I've said this on the podcast before, but you sort of spend more and more money on the car in order to spend less and less time in the driver's seat, and at some point you sort of start thinking to yourself, hey, this probably doesn't actually make a lot of sense. But yeah. I'll still fondly remember running low 8-second passes. When everything comes together, there's no better feeling in the world. All right, let's sort of come back to your education. So, do you have any formal qualifications that you've sort of applied into your business now, or is everything sort of been self-taught?
Pretty much everything's been self-taught. I'm just a high school graduate, didn't go to college or any kind of trade school, just had a desire and a hunger to try and learn, and that's what's gotten me here. So, yeah.
Where did the sort of passion for fabrication and that sort of seed initially get planted for learning these skills?
Well, as far as like the fabrication stuff, to be honest, I don't think it wasn't one of those things that I woke up and, every morning went, man, I really want to learn how to stick metal together or, cut it apart. It was mostly, I had cars that I owned. They're cheap cars at the time that I wanted either to engine swap or, oh man, I would like to do X, Y, or Z. And like a lot of us, you don't have the budget to go to a reputable shop and have it done. So, the option is you pull it into the side yard and you get out a grinder and you figure it out. And that's really where it started, was just from, if you want to have A, you got to do B. And
That's it's all well and good saying that, but I mean, I kind of went through a similar sort of stage in my life as well. When I started my own business, I was primarily, as I mentioned, engine tuning and engine building. But when you're starting to modify cars, at some point, light fabrication really becomes a necessity. So I kind of stumbled into doing some very basic fabrication, but where you and I differ is I still can't lay down a weld that looks like any of yours. So obviously there was something there that separated you from the rest of people just sort of hammering away in the back shed with fabrication. So what drove you to the level you're at today?
I mean, there's man, there's probably a lot of little things, along the way, but I think the first thing was, as doing those things, I really, really enjoyed actually being able to look at something and not know how to do it. And then the problem solving aspect, I was just really drawn to. I've got a problem. This engine doesn't fit. This turbo doesn't go here, whatever, whatever it may be. I really, really enjoyed having to figure that out. And then going from there, you figure out how to physically get something to stick together or what have you. And then, like a lot of things, but, with welding or fabrication in general, like you're never ever going to be as good as you wish you were, so it's a constant carrot, dangled in front of me. Like, I could lay down one of the best welds I've done to date. There's always someone who's going to do it better. There's always a weld out there, whether, and especially nowadays with the internet, you go online, there's always someone better than you at whatever. And it gives you that constant, like, man, I need to figure out how to do that. I need to figure out how to progress my skill set so that I can have that too.
So always striving for that next level, essentially.
Yeah, and a lot of it initially, especially, came from, man, I would really love to own, whatever it is, a turbo kit or one of those cages or a car that looks like that or has that design or fabrication implemented. And the method in which I had to get it was, well, I guess I have to learn how to do it then. And so that's kind of what kind of got me on the path. And then I found I really actually enjoyed it. I enjoy the chase. And then, as difficult it is and how many days I go in here and yell at cars and whatever I'm working at, it's still the end result's like, man, I did that and I'm proud of that. And with each thing I do, no matter how many cages I do or what have you, they keep getting better, little by little. And, maybe not to, an onlooker or the customer, but there's little things here and there. Like, man, that's better than it was. And I'm proud of that. So that's kind of what drove me.
Obviously to be expected, it is a skill that gets refined the more you practice it. So yeah, understandable. The more cages you build, the better the cages are going to be. Coming back to being self-taught, what sort of resources were you using in order to sort of hone your fabrication skills, particularly if we get into maybe some of the welding side of things, and when we're talking about TIG welding of some of the more exotic materials, titanium, aluminium even, there's a lot that goes into understanding how to set up the welder for that. So yeah, I'm interested how you sort of learned those skills and refined them.
Yeah, so initially bought a TIG welder and knew I wanted to learn it. So got online, started reading on I forget what the website is. There's welding tips and tricks. So a couple of guys, so like Jody, I think is the guy's name, but I watched I think every single TIG welding video that he has. And then I went on his website, which was a forum. I don't know if it still is, but read through and kind of read through whether I was having a problem with what I was doing or not. Read through everything I could find. And that got me, what I would consider a pretty decent foundation, pretty decent understanding of like, if this happens, it's maybe this or this or this, and from there, then once you sort of understand the foundation and the basics of it, what's happening, I'm not no metallurgist, but on a foundational level of what's happening to the metal, then from there, I was able to kind of deduce based off context, what might make this better, or how do these welds that I may see online or what have you, why are they the way they are? And what's the purpose? Like, say for instance, ripple stacking, like as far as the actual form of the weld and how close together your dab spacing is and all that stuff. All those little things that make a weld look better or worse, in my opinion. Why do you see these guys that are career welders? Why do they do it this way? You kind of have to work backwards and deduce, and you can try and read online, but at a certain point, it's kind of one of those things you got to deduce and figure out based off of your previous experience and understanding of what's happening when you're welding something. Titanium, it's kind of no different. Once I got to the point of welding titanium, I had welded a decent amount of stainless and chromoly, aluminum, got to that point, and then, okay, well, it needs to be shielded, all the kind of the basics of what the metal's going to do. And then from there, the basics, color's not great. You don't want color. How do you avoid that? So argon and coverage and everything else. And then I just got into testing it and playing with it and found what I think works for me, and as long as it didn't present any problems, which when it did, you go back to the drawing board, but as long as it didn't present any problems, you just start chipping away at that and honing the skill at that. So as you experience like, oh, it's really sticky. It's like, okay, well, it likes more heat, stuff like that.
Yeah. Probably getting a little deep a little early, but seeing as you just mentioned shielding gas there with the argon, can we talk a little bit more about the requirements for this, particularly when we're talking about reactive materials such as stainless steel or titanium? What is the process here for welding these materials?
So stainless, titanium, Inconel, anything, nickel-based, stuff like that, right? Reactive metal, so it doesn't like oxygen. So once you get it molten or get it to a certain point, it'll react with the oxygen and create oxidation, right? So rust or sugaring or what have you. Sugaring that'll lead to rust. So with stainless and titanium, Inconel, you prep it all. So you get it all, fit together how you want. You prep it all. So like titanium, so stainless is probably the easiest of those three. It's the most, what would you call it? It'll deal with the most amount of oxidation. Let's put it that way. I can't think of the right word. And so stainless, I'll go through, if I'm doing a stainless downpipe for something or a full stainless exhaust, depending on what it's going to see, it'll be 304, 321, and go through and clean all my edges. So you get it all fit up. I'll usually clean all my edges before I tack it together, so you don't have like a bunch of junk stuck between the mating surfaces, right? And you fit it all, and then you pull it all down, acetone wipe, and then I'll also take a bottle and spray acetone through the inside and make sure it's all as clean as I can get it. Plug the ends, whether it be tinfoil, purge plugs, tape if it's far enough away from the weld joint or whatever, and you stuff argon into it, and then you back purge it. So you fill whatever cavity it is that you're welding, fill it with argon, and then I use a really big gas like cup. So use a gas lens in the TIG torch exclusively. I don't mess with call-up bodies or anything. And then, then you go through and a big gas cup. So I think on stainless, I'll go down, the smallest I'll go is like a 14. And then on titanium, Inconel, I'll go up to a 20, something like that. And you basically make sure the inside is full of argon, an inert gas. So argon, you do helium, so that no oxygen gets to the backside of the weld as it's molten. And then on the outside, travel speed, everything else, travel speed, amperage, all that matters. And that's where technique really comes in and kind of chipping away, like I was saying earlier, chipping away at your skills on what likes what.
You've just mentioned sort of about a million different items that I really want to go back and dig into individually. So for a start, what you're talking about here with this back purging, when we're TIG welding or MIG welding for that matter, we've got an inert gas being supplied through the torch, which is shielding the weld area. But what you're talking about here is what's happening inside of the pipe, which we can't really see initially. And you can get a nice looking weld on the outside of the pipe, but without back purging and protecting that molten interior, that's going to react with the oxygen inside, and then you're going to end up with this sugaring, and visually it's a very obvious difference between something that's been back purged. Now, two aspects that I see with this as being problematic is one, probably the main one, is that this is going to, if you haven't back purged, say a stainless exhaust primary, you end up with a potential weakness in that weld internally, which can result in cracking and failure at a later point versus something that's been properly purged.
Yep. Yeah, so that sugaring on the backside is basically, the way I try to look at it is there's a whole bunch of metallurgy going on there, right? Chemical, like chemist stuff, right? And then, but the basic way I try to look at it is like, it's like having advanced rust on the inside. So it's like, yeah, it can live, there's a lot of exhausts out there that aren't back purged, but when you're providing the service, that I want to provide, you back purge it.
You want to give it the best chance of living, correct?
Yeah, so it not only is like advanced rust in the fact that it's corrosive and it's going to grow and it's going to end up cracking at some point, but also it's going to catch a lot of contaminants and it's also not smooth. Say in the instance of a primary, you want the inside of that primary as smooth as possible so that, exhaust gases and everything else don't have to deal with this crusty cauliflower looking stuff sticking out of it.
Yeah, that was going to be my sort of second point, is the advantage of purging. Probably a little bit less significant, but yeah, anything that's going to impede flow, particularly in an exhaust primary, obviously not what we want. All right, so that process of back purging, you pretty much just explained it. You basically block off both ends of the pipe that you're working on, fill the interior with argon, leave that to flow for a bit before you start your weld, and then you protect it on the inside and the outside. Now, I also wanted to just talk about the fit up, the prep that you kind of glossed over there. Because I sort of think with my very, very basic level of TIG welding, I've sort of found, and I've obviously been around fabricators as well. We've employed fabricators here at HPA. It's almost the prep work and the time you put into that and the cleanliness that's almost more important to a degree than the actual welding itself. And if you sort of do all of the prep work correctly, then the welding is much more straightforward and simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's definitely correct. I mean, you can get away with an ugly weld. It's hard to get away with really bad prep and then an ugly weld. So going through prep, say for instance, in this instance, using a primary like a header or a turbo manifold or something like that, right? Say you're using schedule 10, 304 or 321 for that matter, doesn't matter, but it's very thick. But say on your prep, you don't bevel the edges, right? And you just leave it. And then you're trying to weld this 100,000, 120,000 thick pipe together. And you're either going to have to hammer it with amperage, which is going to cook it, or, you're just not going to get full penetration. And then when that thing gets to, 1400 degrees, it's going to try and crack, as it expands, it's going to be a weak spot thin. So, and then same goes for, say you're making a tubular 321 manifold, 16 gauge. So it's nice and thin. You're going to get full penetration and you don't get a good back purge on it. So where you either got a leak or you have big gaps downstream and they're bleeding argon off and letting in oxygen. You've got a little spot, say you get sugar, 3 welds down the primary, and it might be okay strength wise, but if a little piece of that sugar breaks off and goes into the turbine housing, that's bad news. And, then you get a customer calling you upset that you blew the turbo up and everything else. So prep is very, very important, and it makes the welding job, like you said, a lot easier, a lot more straightforward. You get a good back purge on a primary. The argon also cools the back of the weld, so it doesn't run away quite as quickly. So normally, if I start something like, man, it doesn't seem right, 9 times out of 10, because I've been doing this for a number of years now, and stuff still happens. You swing the hood down, you got a positioner running, you don't realize that it swung and the plug fell out of the top because you can't see it, right? And you're running, and all of a sudden you're like, man, this puddle's moving all over the place. This is not normal. You stop what you're doing and pull the hood up, and you realize, oh, it's because there's no argon and the tube's crazy hot because the argon's not chilling the whole thing, keeping it nice and cool inside. And you say a couple bad words and you get the bandsaw and cut out your bad piece and redo it,
And this really is another area that comes from experience. You know from experience how the weld should progress, and when it's not doing that straight away, you're starting to question, why is this different to how it should be.
Yeah. And there's, so you really quickly run through that myriad of things it could be in your head. You're like, okay, well, did I prep in between the 2 pieces, or does it have a bunch of, say a little bit of aluminum oxide or whatever from the sanding disc on it still, because I didn't actually clean the edge before I stuck the 2 pieces together, right? You're like, nope, I cleaned it. So it's like, all right, well, probably argon then. So you flip the hood up and see your fate.
Yeah. The fit up as well, particularly when you're TIG welding, you don't really have the ability to fill much, if anything, in terms of a gap. Plus, as you sort of mentioned there, if you've got poor fit up, you're going to be losing a lot of that argon from the back purging as well. So are you aiming for perfection, or is there some room for a little bit of a gap that you can fill with a TIG welder?
I mean, I personally always aim for as perfect as I can get it. I have a buddy of mine that Sean, perfection's not possible, but you want to chase it, so I always aim for perfection, but it depends on the material. Say like a 321 turbo manifold or turbo header, 16 gauge, or on my car, 18 gauge 321 header. I don't want to see light through any kind of crack, because I know that material that thin, if you open up a little hole, you're going to chase it halfway down the tube trying to fill it up, or you're going to stuff a bunch of filler in it and have a bump on the inside. So stuff like that. But then you move to like, 1.75" 0.95 chromoly roll cage. My rule of thumb is if I'm using a 16th filler, I don't want to be able to put it into the gap if I can help it. But I'm also not an elitist, so you get into a cage and you spend 3 hours notching this crazy junction tube, and you've got one spot in the ditch of the thing that you can stick the filler in, it'll be okay. Especially if you don't sit on it with, 150 amps for 20 seconds and make the thing worse. But a lot of that comes from history and my knowing what I can do safely and what I can't. As a welder, there's a lot of guys out there that are better than me that probably take a 332 gap and make it never look like it was ever there and be completely comfortable and confident in it. But I know my limitations.
Now, you've talked about a bunch of different materials there, and I just wouldn't mind getting a little bit more information. You've talked about 304, 321, Inconel. I think also the Schedule 10 thick wall stainless. I think one of the problems we see, particularly with maybe turbo exhaust manifolds, is they do have a tendency or reputation for cracking. And I think a lot of that also comes down to properly supporting. There's obviously a fairly large amount of mass with the turbocharger hanging off that manifold once the thing's glowing red hot. Supporting the weight of that turbocharger and the wastegate's definitely a big part of keeping the manifold alive. But material choice for particularly a turbo manifold, pros and cons of those materials that you just mentioned.
So let's say, for instance, my preference is usually a 321 tubular manifold, so 16 gauge, just because you are saving a little bit of weight. Also, the bends and the radius of the bends and whatnot can be a little bit looser, which, when you're talking about fluid dynamics, it's a little bit easier for the exhaust gases to make their way through it quickly. But one of the downsides, I guess the downside being cost. Good 321 16 gauge that can handle the heat, and I always end up bracing them, but can handle the heat and the expansion and everything else that comes with it. It's not cheap.
Could you give us sort of an example of 304 versus 321? Are we talking a factor of double the price, or whereabouts are we price wise?
Yeah, there's different manufacturers, and that's one thing that I've noticed is manufacturer pricing is different. So, for instance, if I go online and buy something that may be offshore, 321 stainless, versus if I go down to SPD around the corner and buy Rath Gibson 321 that's made in, I believe, Wisconsin, right now, probably triple.
Wow, okay.
For, US 321 versus an offshore 321. Now, that said, there's, like I said before, I'm not an elitist. I don't want to be the guy that's bashes some things and wants to go with others, but application to application, I think there's a place for all of it. So you kind of have to go, in my instance, I kind of go with what I think my customer's doing with the car and what I think fits their best if budget's a concern of theirs. And I do run them through kind of the risk versus reward thing. If you can swing it, always try and go with the most superior thing you can, but not everybody's made of money. My money tree died a long time ago. So going with that, I guess you got your 321 and its benefit going to be weight, so weight, bend radius, overall flow characteristics. Not that you can't do something great with a Schedule 10.
In terms of the reliability of 321 versus Schedule 10, fabricated, the perfect conditions we've just talked about, are they as reliable as each other?
I think depending on how it's built, yes. One of the things that I try to stay away from is your tubular manifolds unsupported. So you say you build a 321 16 gauge or 18 gauge turbo header and you use a welded collector and no bellow and you don't support it, it's going to break. And then I support them. I use a double slip merge collector and then I use an Inconel bellow so that it can all grow and move a little bit as it gets hot. And then also as the car vibrates and bounces up the road, your supported turbo that's maybe supported on the chassis. This is all, I guess I should have precursored this with solid engine mounts. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do this on a rubber engine mount.
Yeah, you wouldn't be mounting it to the chassis. Yeah.
Right. So you mount, turbo to the chassis, and then you have an up pipe, if you will, with a 321 or preferably an Inconel bellow. And then you have your double slip merge collector and then your tubular turbo manifold in 321. That way the header can grow with the engine as it gets crazy hot, as it glows. It can grow and expand, and it's not going to break itself off the merge collector. And then as the engine's vibrating and the chassis is vibrating differently, that Inconel bellow can also take up some of the vibration so you don't end up as much at the turbo flange, whether V-band or T4 or whatever.
Yeah. In terms of the bracing for the turbocharger, one of the considerations is that your manifold is going to grow as it heats up. So solid mounting the turbocharger to the chassis or the engine block might seem like a great idea, but that's going to rigidly mount the turbocharger in one place. What I've sort of gravitated towards doing is using sort of a link between the engine block and the turbocharger exhaust housing, usually with rod ends to allow a little bit of movement. I mean, it's still not ideal because obviously the turbocharger can then only move in the radius of that mount. But how do you approach that? Similar, or have you got a better technique?
Yeah, so that works. So like for instance, car that I work on and sponsor, it's a NSX with a turbo K, and that turbo, so solid engine mounts, and then the turbo is actually mounted to the chassis. And then I do that exact 321 turbo header, double slip merge, and then Inconel bellow. And that it allows for enough movement to where the engine and the vibration and the growth doesn't affect it. And then going forward, same guy as a turbo K Lotus. And that one, I mounted the turbo to the engine transmission union, and it does use a plate mount, but the plate is single bolt on the bottom, so it holds the thing up. But should it grow, it can rotate in the direction of the growth, so it can push itself away a little bit. So kind of like using something in bending versus tension and compression. So it's in tension or in compression with the turbo sitting on it, it supports its weight perfectly fine. But it's all hogged out and then also on a single bolt, so it can flex itself away should it need to.
I guess the use of the double slip joint merge collector, though, does help to a point because it will allow those primaries to sort of expand inside of that merge collector, correct?
Yeah.
So that would be always preferable to a welded collector.
I prefer it, yeah. So not only for that reason, but then also for ease of assembly and disassembly. Say you get down the road and one of the primaries does crack at the flange. And I guess I should say all of these things, we're dealing with race cars, and race cars love to break things. They eat parts, right? So you do your best practice, and then, down the road, stuff's probably going to happen. But say in an unwelded slip-on collector, down the road, you end up with a cracked primary at the head. You don't really, especially on something, race cars run race gas or something methanol, something crazy, right? You don't want to actually just weld that joint again, even though you could. You want to get in there and clean the inside, gouge the thing out, make sure there's no contaminants in the crack. And then you also want to find the ends of the crack. Well, doing all of that when you're welded to a collector, and then also trying to get a good back purge on the thing, is just not favorable. Versus, you have a slip-on merge. I'll just slip the merge off and then cut that tube off the flange and redo the whole tube, and then slip it back together. So it gives a little more longevity there as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And obviously this is one of the things that's not an option if we're using a Schedule 10, the thick wall tube, because you can't have a double slip merge collector for that. I'm interested with these merge collectors. Are you making these yourself? I mean, there's a lot of off-the-shelf options now, quality merge collectors from the likes of Burn Stainless, which we've personally used. I guess, where does the time versus money component come into hand fabricating these, which I can imagine is a massively time-consuming process, versus using an off-the-shelf item?
Yeah, so I've done both. Earlier in my career, I built all of them, and some of that was in extreme transparency. Most of that was because of poor budgeting on my part, and poor billing, and so your time, while it does have a rate attached to it, when you're upside down on a job, it's like, well, time's the first one to go. So I've built a number of them. I built the ones on my car because I couldn't find a suitable off the shelf. But yeah, going forward, so those two cars that I mentioned, both of them have SPD, which is local to me. Then they know Burns. I think they work in cahoots a lot of times, but SPD double slip 321 merges on them. Like you mentioned, the time versus money and what's worthwhile, it's almost always upside down on a merge collector, especially if it's not your everyday building merge collectors. It's a time consuming endeavor. And especially as you get into smaller, thinner materials. So, you have 20 gauge 321 merge collector, it has to fit perfect. It's, 39 thousandths or something like that thick. So, any gap becomes a very big gap very quickly.
No room to hide, really.
No, there's no hiding. And, even on my best days, you sit on the pedal a little too long, or you don't move quite in time, you make your life a little bit more miserable.
Yeah. All right, I want to just come back a couple of steps here. You were talking about gas lenses. So again, for the non-fabricators out there, can you explain what a gas lens is, how these sizes differ, why you would choose a particular size over another for a particular application?
Yeah, so the gas lens is actually the your consumables in your torch. So if you take a TIG torch apart, you actually unscrew the cup, and you've got when you get them out of the box or with your welder, it has a standard collet in it, which is a little finger looking thing that sticks out of the end. It's usually got holes in it, and that's what lets the gas, the inert gas, argon, helium, what have you, out of the torch and covers with the weld, right? So it just comes out of those holes and just kind of belches onto the part. Gas lenses actually screw into the torch, and they have a diffused, so with a diffuser on their orifice, mesh diffuser. So as the argon comes out of the torch, it actually is dispersed a lot more evenly. And then from there, it goes through your cup, which the cup size is more variable. So that's where you see, little ones that are a little, they're all in, I believe, 16ths of an inch is how they're represented. So your 6 is 6/16, 8's a half inch, so they go all the way up. I think I don't even know. It goes on for not ever, but there's a lot of different manufacturers, a lot of different sizes out there. So with your standard, I think the standard go-to that you can almost weld just about anything okay is an 8, about half inch, and that's where most people start. Gas lens, number 8 cup, you're pretty much good to go. You guys back in the field, before huge, massive designer cups, so to speak, everything was welded with an 8. Some sort of form or fashion of that. And it's enough coverage to basically be able to you could do stainless with it. Technically, you could probably do tie with it. You could do almost anything with it. It's just going to be more difficult. It's because you can't cover as much material with your dispersion of the gas. So my standard go-to is I use an 8 for tacking stuff. So I'm tacking a cage in a car, I tack it with an 8. And then your more reactive metals, I'll tack with a 12. And then from there on a roll cage non-reactive metal, I'll weld it with a 12. And then, so that's 3/4 of an inch. And then these also, as they get bigger, will have diffusers in the cup as well. So you're getting 2 layers of diffusion of that inert gas that cover the weld, which leads to a larger area that you can service per weld, and then also a larger amount of stick out on the tungsten, the actual electrode that you're heating the metal with. You can stick it further out of said cup because of that diffusion of the gas. It can reach further, essentially.
So that's going to be beneficial when you're sort of trying to get into tight spots. You can have more stick out with the tungsten to get it where it needs to be, but still you've got that sufficient gas coverage. You're not going to end up with oxidation in the weld.
Yeah. As long as you up your regulator, so you're pushing more CFH per weld, per actuation, basically. So, say I've got 1.5 inches of stick out, I'm probably pushing the regulator on a roll cage. That is, I'm probably 50 CFH, something like that. I'm just hammering it out of the thing. And part of that is I'm able to do that because of the diffusion of the gas lens and the diffuser in the cup. So instead of it getting super turbulent and tumbling everywhere, because it's just like a garden hose, it's actually diffusing and coming out a little more uniform, and it's not actually pulling oxygen into it with the turbulence, right? So there's a lot of little things that you pick up over the years, I guess.
Yeah, no doubt at all. So I'm glad that you just mentioned the gas flow, because that's another one of the sort of levers essentially you have available to adjust. And I guess probably those uninitiated to TIG welding would think, well, why do I need this gas lens? If we need more gas coverage, surely I can just turn the gas flow up. That's not the case though.
Not necessarily. I guess it's not quite that simple. You can, but there's a line that you'll crest, unless you have these consumables and kind of have your setup, with kind of anything, which I'm, probably better than me, you start pushing anything that's related to fluid dynamics out something very quickly without diffusion and uniformity. It'll tumble and pull oxygen in with it. And then you end up with oxygen intermingled and intertangled with your shielding gas, which defeats the purpose of having it. And so, all these diffusion methods, whether it be, I know that one of the lenses I think it uses a 16, and I think its diffuser is actually 3 layers, and so it basically keeps all of it spread out, straightens it all out so that when it comes out, it's going straight. It's not crisscrossing and running into itself and, creating all kinds of craziness. And so I know I'm sure everybody's seen it online, but if you follow any welding pages, there's videos of guys with, a gas lens versus a collet body, and they use smoke, and you see it come out in this nice even plume versus just this mess of garden hose, smoke coming out of it. So
yeah, we've did that exact demonstration in our TIG welding course, and I mean it makes it very, very obvious when you can actually physically see the smoke, because obviously the argon we flow through it, you can't see it, so you don't really know what's going on. But when you actually see smoke coming through a gas lens versus not, it really, how well it's diffused, the lack of turbulence is very, very obvious. All right, let's talk about one of the materials that I really struggle with, which is aluminium, welding aluminium, quite different to ferrous materials. So what are the challenges when it comes to alloy welding?
There's a lot of them. If you were to ask me what's the hardest, I would say aluminum is the hardest. I can't say all of them, I welded a lot of metals, and titanium, Inconel, in my opinion, aluminum's harder. It's harder to get a good weld. It's finicky. I actually, you can ask anybody that knows me, has been around the shop, I hate aluminum. Just as a metal, it drives me nuts. It's really picky. So it has an oxide layer on it. So you have to weld it on AC, which is alternating current, and I should precursor this, I'm no expert in everything. There's a lot of people that know a lot more than me, but the way I understand it is alternating current, instead of your heat source, so to speak, the way I tell myself is, instead of your heat source coming out of the torch all the time and going through the part into the ground, you're going to alternate that between coming out of the torch, going to the ground, and then actually turning around and going from the ground back up to the electrode. And so that's why it buzzes, makes a bunch of noise, everything else. But that alternation is what allows you to break up that surface oxide layer on the aluminum, and then you can actually get to the weldable part of the alloy.
So key with that is, for those, and we'll talk a little bit more about welding machine choices soon, but for those who want to be able to weld both ferrous and non-ferrous materials, an AC/DC TIG welder is going to be essential. So generally we're DC for a ferrous material, stainless, mild steel, etc., and AC for alloy.
Yep. And so, with that material prep, it's an alloy, it's a very dirty material. It also doesn't like having anything but its own filth on it.
So you can get yourself into real problems if you're, for example, cutting aluminium tube with a cut-off wheel or something that's been used on a ferrous material previously, because it impregnates the aluminium with ferrous material particles, correct?
Right, yeah. So certain things are more potent than others, as far as I've found, around the shop. So, for instance, cutting aluminum with a cut-off wheel, a death wheel on a grinder, is just a losing battle, and I won't do it, so, but then, you use a bandsaw, and that's where material prep really does come in. So, like, for instance, say one of the things around my shop that's, I think, common, but, not every shop does any kind of everything. So I do a lot of different stuff. So for instance, I have an S2000 in the shop, do a cage, and then it also needs a turbo kit. And so instead of changing all of my consumables through the whole shop, bandsaw blades, sanding discs, everything, I have a select amount of tools I'll even use on aluminum, but bandsaw being one of them. I cut a bunch of roll cage tubing or what have you on this bandsaw, or stainless steel tubing for that matter, building this turbo kit. And then I move on to the cold side, and blade's brand new. I'm not going to change it just to cut the aluminum. So my workaround is I'll cut the aluminum with it, but then I take, and with a DA, with an 80 grit pad on it, I'll DA the edge and basically clean it all, so it's like a nice, bright, fresh finish. And then I also Scotch Brite and file the edges more times than not, to make sure all the burrs are gone and everything else. And then also make sure that I have like a file as the last thing, so it's not transferring, aluminum oxide or any kind of sanding disc material onto the aluminum. And that's the way that I found that I get the nicest aluminum welds. And it's just one of those other things where I turn around and go, this material does some things great, but man, is it a pain in the ass. It's a finicky, very picky material.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those who have tried welding aluminium and realized how tricky it is, I think it makes you appreciate, when you see a real quality weld on alloy, it just makes you appreciate the skill of the person who's laid that down. So essentially, though, we've already talked about the importance of cleanliness and prep. we kind of just ratchet that up to 11 on the scale when we're dealing with aluminium?
Yeah, for the most part, I do anyway. I'm sure there's a lot of guys out there that have really good luck with, maybe less prep, or they do aluminum every day. I know a couple of guys that do aluminum on the daily, and I'm sure they've got it down to where they know exactly what they can get away with. Unfortunately, I do everything, and in the same day I'll weld 3 different types of material, throughout the shop. And so it's always a little bit of a not a guessing game, but a little bit of a unknown. So I just try and throw everything in the kitchen sink at it as far as prep, so that I can get through, what I'm doing with a high rate of success and be happy with the weld and the product that I finish up with.
I guess it's always better to sort of go overkill with prep, and then if you do have a problem with the weld later on, we sort of can say to yourself, well, hey, I gave it the best chance possible. Whereas if you sort of take shortcuts there and things go bad, well, you'd be kicking yourself, because it's really hard to come back from that, or at least it's going to be very time consuming to come back from that. All right, speaking of coming back from things, let's move right back here, because we sort of jumped down this rabbit hole quite a long way, and I think what we want to do is kind of come back and get a sense of what happened from leaving school up to the point where you actually started RS Motorsport, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that.
All right, so I guess how much time we got? I guess the long version.
We've got as long as you want.
Okay, all right. So I, at the age of 8, started racing bicycles, BMX, and started doing that. My dad took me out to the local track up in Washington State, and I was immediately hooked, and was playing soccer at the time, did a couple years doing both. And then about 10 years old, was getting better, racing the BMX, and it's kind of the decision time. Like, hey, you can't do both. If you're going to do something, you got to both feet, like, all the way, right? And I chose the bike. I did that as my primary objective from that day until I was 25. So 15 years of it was my obsession, and admittedly a little obsessive in nature. Once I kind of lock in on something, it's very, very difficult for me to move on. So I did that, and it took me basically up the ranks. I ended up turning pro right after 16. So I think I was pro at 17, and I raced professionally from 17 until 25, which was, the only thing I cared about, basically. And through that, there's a lot of injuries. Anybody knows BMX, there's a lot of injuries, and it's a very demanding sport with very little reward. So I was living at home, not really making much money, constantly getting broke off. The way I raced was always a little more risky than, you needed to be. And if I saw a gap, I went for it, and you crash and break your arm. Like, that's what happens, right? So I went through, and at 25, so this whole time, my dad's still doing his thing, working the trades, and still, he loved cars. So I got to love cars, right? That's just how it works, handed down. And so I turned 16 and go through a couple cars, ended up in vintage BMWs, back when they were affordable. And I got into one of those, and, and then, you start fiddling around, and, I met Mike at Stance Works, and, you go through and you're like trying to lower it, and the stance thing was cool, and you're going through that, and, started fiddling with engine swaps. And, my first car was a 72 Chevy pickup. Still have it. It's got a 434 inch small block in it, and learned how to drive in it, learned how to do burnouts in it, learned how to wreck a car in it. Still have it, and
all that good stuff.
Yeah, right. So the whole time while I'm racing BMX, on my off days, I'm, thinking about what I can try and fiddle with on this car or that car or whatever. And as time went on, it started to get a little more serious, and, I started getting a little more into the fab stuff. Fast forward to probably 2000, or I guess what year would it have been? We'll use age because I'm better at that. But I'm, around 23, 24, and had a lot of really pretty bad injuries to this point. And, you start looking at, okay, so what's my plan from here? I'm 23, 24 years old.
Yeah, it's probably a career as a pro BMX racer. It's probably not going to get you through to sort of retirement age, is it?
No, not at all. So, and
it's not an old person's sport.
It's definitely not. It's barely a young person's sport. It's chews you up and spits you out pretty good, So 23, 24, started to realize, like, I'm not even 25 yet, and getting out of bed's a little tough sometimes. And, there's things I can't do, in the gym or, whatever. And start to think, okay, so my goal at the time was I want to make it to 30. That was I need to give this everything I have till I'm 30. And then after that, my other thing, the only other thing I do is these cars. So maybe I move into that. I go get a job or whatever. And so went through, ended up breaking both my wrists that year, laid up for a while, and then get back. And like within that first year of getting back, 25 at this point, ended up Colorado. I was on tour racing and ended up with an off and broke my shoulder pretty bad. I ended up with 2 surgeries in a year of therapy and got back to like 65% active range of motion. So shoulders junk. I've got 11 screws and a plate, 4 cables and anchors in my shoulder that hold it together. And, through this process, my parents were supportive the whole time I lived at home. They've always been supportive. I've been through numerous injuries at this point, basically getting hurt in the hospital once a year for the last 10 years, and they're always there to help me, get put back together. Right. And on this one, enough time had elapsed that addiction, if you will, to that sport and to getting back started to fade. It's been a year and you start to think like, man, I'm making not a whole lot of money. And I've been like unable to barely brush my teeth for a year. And what am I doing?
Yeah, I mean, it must really make you sort of think twice about getting back on a bike when that's the sort of potential outcome.
Honestly, I think so. Enough time had gone by, and the part, and you could ask my dad, up until that month 11, I was getting back. That's the only thing I knew, right? Is you get hurt. It doesn't matter. It's just, you got to get back. And, I think the thing that kind of made me think about it a little more clearly was, the doctor of first saying, hey, I'm not to meddle in your personal business, but I'm one of the better shoulder surgeons out here. And with everything in your shoulder now, if you hit the ground again like you did, you're getting a full replacement at 25 years old. And that's not smart. And also, they don't last for forever, apparently. It's like, so then you're looking at a reverse in 10, 15 years, which after a reverse, what do you do after that? And so it made me think about it a little bit. And it's easy to shrug off a doctor, and, but my parents, is the first time I think that my parents kind of didn't ask me to stop, but asked me to think about it. It's the first time I really looked at the rest of my life and realized, hey, if I crash all the time. If I do this again, like we're talking the rest of my life be in real bad shape.
Yeah, that'd be enough to make you sit up and really rethink your life choices.
Yeah, exactly. And so at that point, I had my car, the Trans Am, the Pontiac, kind of in mind that I wanted to build one. So at that point, I kind of made the decision that I either am going to stick it out till 30 or until I have another, get off and smoke myself, or I can give that car a go, figure out a way to make it happen and go that route and start the rest of my life, so to speak, a little early. Kind of the way I am. I close that chapter of my book and joke around. It seems like a lifetime ago, but seems like a different book. But I closed that chapter and moved on and just sunk all of that desire and all of that energy into my car and the full effort to make it a life.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about the car in a bit more detail, but before we get into that, let's talk about RS Motorsport. So straight from BMX into essentially your own thing. Now, you said that you decided you wanted to build this Trans Am, but I mean, that also takes a huge amount of money and time. How were you sort of funding that? Did you start doing customer work right off the bat to sort of fund the build of this car?
Not really. I did a couple little things for guys around town. So in this 12-month recovery process, I think probably 10 months or so in, basically after the second surgery, I've gone through therapy, everything. Ended up getting a job at a local suspension company, ground control. So they're up the hill from me, about 20 minutes away. And I had been a customer for years for the old BMWs, right? Ended up going up there, knew them fairly well, had decent rapport, and they were looking for somebody to kind of work on taking photos around the shop and then, maybe build a website, right? And so I ended up getting a job with them. So I worked there from that point for, say, about 18 months. So I did that. I was still living at home. So I'm able to put, my paychecks basically into, I was going to say the bank, but they didn't go there, into the car. And then I also had accumulated, those old BMWs that used to be affordable. I had at the time at the house, I think had 3 of those engine swaps, all kind of, niced up, polished up everything. And then had a couple old Mercedes W108s, and I had 2000s BMW wagon, and my dad and I put together a 49 Chevy pickup with a 12 valve Cummins on air ride, stuff like that were all at the house. And then I also had a Datsun that I had actually kind of built with it being kind of a sacrificial lamb to go onto my own thing, right? And so I figured, trying to add up numbers in my head, I was like, okay, so if I'm working, I'm not making a whole bunch at work, making enough, but not enough to build a car. So I kind of sat for a while, I thought about it and realized, okay, so I've got to start getting rid of stuff, to try and fund this, and, going in order of importance to me, with the only non-negotiable being my truck, the 72 Chevy pickup, my first car. It's like, I won't get rid of it, but
never getting sold.
Right. And so, started down that path, started selling stuff and buying things for the next car. And then, started an engine build with the engine builder. And, I'm basically just, my bank account for the couple years I was building the car, I don't think at any point had more than $400 in it for more than a week. I'm spending it just as fast as I can find it.
Straight in and straight back out on parts.
Yeah. It's a pass through. So, so I was just doing that, working, between 8 and 5 up at ground control up the hill. And then I'd get home, and basically from 5:30 till the small hours in the morning, working on the car in the side yard. And then all the hours on the weekends, just chipping away.
All right. Well, this segues pretty conveniently into talking about the car in a little bit more detail, and I think this is probably how I first sort of stumbled across your Instagram account. The car is sort of pretty recognisable, and I think most people probably have seen it, or a lot of people have seen it. What is it for a start?
So it's a 1970 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. It's a tube chassis car at this point.
Sure. So was the idea from the outset to do a full tube chassis and everything that you've done to the car now, or has it evolved over the time you started building it?
When my dad and I drug it onto the side yard, it was actually going to be a back half car. They're a subframe car from the start. So I was like, okay, well, I'll unbolt the front end, the clip, and I'll build one of those. I wanted to figure out some suspension kinematics, wanted to learn a little bit. And so I was like, okay, well, I want to do an IRS in it. So I'll chop the back off basically behind the seats, and then I'll build a back half for it that houses some sort of IRS, and then roll cage, and then maybe I'll put an LS in it. And kind of started down the road, got the thing blasted, and it kind of started to evolve to, well, weight distribution is important, so I think I should push the engine back. And it's like, okay, well, then you're getting rid of the firewall. And I'm like, okay, well, then if I push the engine back, and I'm going through all of these mental kinesthetics while I'm at home, kind of building this car hypothetically in my head. I realized that by the time I get through all these little, problems, there's not really any car left other than the seat pan right under you. And then like, well, then I should move myself back a little bit. And then, so realized I was like, hey, well, there's nothing left. I should just build a chassis car. Like, why not? And in that instance, with that chassis, that starting point, there isn't a why not. There's no other better reason, and there's a going forward with more modern cars or other platforms. I think there's a lot of reasons maybe not to, but in that instance, it made sense. And so by the time we had kind of got it back from blasting, drug it up on the table, realized, I guess I'm building a tube chassis car. That's kind of it. It evolved as I went, but I was on the couch, recovering for a lot of that mental build it in your head 1,000 times kind of thing.
So you had a pretty clear picture of what you were going to do before you ever actually got started working on the car.
Right. Yep.
All right. And I'm interested at this point, what would you sort of class your fabrication skill set as? Are you sort of expert at this point? Because, it's not a small task. You're really sort of jumping straight in the deep end, building a full tube chassis car.
Oh, so then back when I started, what was it?
Yeah. Were you sort of, would you class yourself as expert when you started building the car?
No, no. Part of that whole car was a learning process. And it was, so the way I kind of went through it in my head was I had this injury, and I was looking at, okay, so the rest of my life, what am I going to do? Right. And, you can go to college, and if I had any inkling of any kind of career path that could be benefited from college, I probably would have gone to college. But for me, it's like, well, I want to be around cars. So either I'm going to go down to the dealer and get a job, turning wrenches, or I'm going to learn how to build race cars and some sort of something I'm into. And at the time, and still, it's race cars. The way I thought about it was, we've surpassed it. It's a silly number. I'm sure you're probably going to think the same, but I was like, if I've got all these cars and I have this job that pays this amount per year, if I sock all that money and then I also sell all these cars, it's going to cost me about $100,000 to go to school. So I could probably build this car instead, and it'll be my education.
It's not a bad way of looking at it.
Yeah, there's some holes that can definitely be poked in it. One of which is the budget, and the second of which is you don't get a diploma or anything. You get to go huff it and work on cars for the rest of your life and struggle with the business aspect. But
you can't race a diploma though.
Yeah, that is correct, and I would have lost it by now. So no, it worked out great. But that was kind of my thought process was, I'm sitting here on the couch laid up. I can either figure out how to go to school and find a career that I can do that can basically afford me the money to maybe do this someday, or I can sacrifice all these things that I have. And thankfully my parents were incredible, and I could live at home and just sink every penny I can find into this car. And I will either garnish the skill set to do it and be able to actually put out sellable work, right? Purchasable work and quality, or I will learn that I can't either do a lot of it skill set wise. I'm not able to learn, or I'm not into it as I thought I was, and I'm not going to end up doing it. But in my mind, that was a worthwhile sacrifice to find all of that out. It was, okay, I've got these items, and yeah, like $100,000 in my head. I was like, that's a lot of money. That's way more money than I had made in my whole life. But it's like, if that's all it costs to find out and not make a mistake that's going to, hurt me, 10 years down the road, that's worth it over and over again to me.
It's quite an interesting perspective, the way you've looked at that, and I can't fault your logic there. I'm interested to know how realistic that budget worked out though.
It wasn't, my math wasn't great, and there's a lot of things it could have been done, sure. Parts wise, I probably could have, but there was some very non-negotiables for me on a car that's supposed to be maybe a business card or something that in my mind at the time I was like, well, either way this goes, this is going to be the last car I build for myself, right? Because either it goes really well and I'm on to customer work and, struggling businessman kind of thing, right? Or it goes really, really bad and I'm broke and I'm having to go get a job. So either way, I was like, this is the last one. So let's, throw everything at it. It's Hail Mary. So that's kind of a lot of how a lot of it came to be, as far as the type of build it was and some of the oddities of it was like, man, if this is the last one, I want to make sure that I make X, Y, and Z count, and they're what I want.
I think quite often with a project of that magnitude as well, you sort of get into a bit of scope creep. What you sort of planned in terms of part selection at the start. You start building it, and the quality of the build is at a high level, so that then drives the decision on some of the other parts. Maybe you actually have to go for a high quality, more expensive part because it kind of fits the rest of the build. I kind of know how that all goes. The process you went through there is actually not too dissimilar to how I got started with my tuning business. I basically built an Evo drag car, and I wanted to run a 10-second pass, and kind of did that, and then decided that maybe going into the 9s and then the 8s, and we were aiming for the 7s would be good. But the amount of money that I poured into that, I fortunately never kept track. I don't think I wanted to know, and I was paying myself a very meager sort of wage at the time as well. Everything was just getting poured into building this car. And at the time, it seemed ludicrous, and I sort of questioned, what I was doing a number of times as I was going through that process. But at the end of the day, I probably couldn't have predicted how well that worked out for my future. It became a mobile business card for my tuning business, and we ended up breaking a world record as well, which sort of helped with our international recognition, which then sort of folded into High Performance Academy. So, I mean, if it probably wasn't for building that car and being broke for, probably the first 5 years of my business career, I probably wouldn't be here now hosting a podcast with you. So it's funny how these things work out. In that respect, how effective has that been as a rolling business card for you?
It's been great. I don't think I could have asked for a better result. And a lot of it, in complete transparency, was total dumb luck. it was the right place, right time for the car. And I've talked to a lot of people, my dad, a lot of people about, I couldn't recreate that. There's not, in the way the world works now, it wouldn't hit like it did, and it wouldn't be as successful as it was. And, so for that, I'm very grateful that it just, I got lucky to a degree and was fortunate enough to be in the right place, the right time in automotive culture. Moving forward, even now, it's a lot of how people know of me, or, when someone's talking about me, even if they don't know who I am, a lot of times they know about the car, and, sometimes, that must segue into business, and it's how I gained a lot of the relationships that I have today as well. I mean, this is the only thing I do. I don't really have a life outside the shop. So, in a sense, those relationships also enrich my business as well in some form or fashion. And they're, largely in part due to that car.
I just wanted to take a moment out of our interview with Riley and talk about a package of courses that's going to be perfect if you want to follow perhaps in Riley's footsteps and start learning how to fabricate for yourself. I think this is one of the skills that every enthusiast should at least have a basic knowledge of. It's going to really expand the range of what you can do on your own car, and it's also going to cut down on the requirement of outsourcing fabrication work to expensive fabrication shops. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting you to take these courses and come out the other end at Riley's level of skill, but everyone has to start somewhere. This package starts with our Motorsport Fabrication Fundamentals course, which, as its name implies, teaches you the fundamental skills and knowledge that you'll need to start making your own parts in your home shop. Now, we start by talking about the different tools you're going to require, and I know a lot of you will be thinking that you're going to have tens of thousands of dollars worth of specialist tools, but we focus on doing a lot with a little, and this means you don't need to have that many tools. We'll talk about what you do need in the basic tool set, as well as what you should be starting to add as you want to expand your range of skills and the jobs that you can take on. We'll also talk about the various materials that you're going to come across when it comes to motorsport fabrication, what sort of materials are suitable for what jobs, and the pros and cons of each and how you need to work with them. We cover personal protective equipment, and I know this isn't a very sexy topic, but no one wants a trip to the A&E with a piece of metal stuck in their eyeball. We talk about design fundamentals because when we are fabricating components for our car, it does help if we have a basic understanding of engineering principles so that we can fabricate something that is going to be safe and fit for purpose while not being unnecessarily heavy. We then move into the practical skills section of the course. Here we talk about design and planning, we talk about measuring and marking, and we cover drilling, cutting, bending, how to use dimple dies, notching tube, tapping holes. We talk about nut plates and Zeus clips, crush tubes, linishing metal, and sharpening drill bits. We also cover briefly at a high level some of the welding techniques used in motorsport fabrication, including MIG and TIG welding, the effect of heat on material. We talk about gas shielding and the penetration of our welds. We also cover how you should be setting up your fabrication space to make it as efficient as possible. This course also includes a library of worked examples where you can watch the various practical skills actually being put to use in a real fabrication job. Next up, we're including our practical TIG welding course, and TIG welding and motorsport fabrication really do go hand in hand. It is one of the most accurate and controllable forms of welding. However, in order to lay down those nice stacked diamond beads of weld, you do need to have a thorough understanding of the material you're working with, the TIG welder, and how to correctly set it up for the material you're welding, and then of course the actual process of laying down that weld. This course starts with an understanding of the TIG welder, how the TIG welder works, the various parts. We cover a TIG welder machine buyer's guide as well, so if you're in the market, we'll teach you everything that you need to know. We cover amp control, tungsten, the shielding gas, gas lenses and cups, purging, filler rod, foot pedal control, and the welder settings. We also cover frequency and AC balance, just to name a few of the topics you'll find in there. We also include the practical skills that you'll need to master in order to become a master on the TIG. This really starts with part preparation. I cannot emphasize how important preparation is. We then cover sharpening the tungsten and setting your tungsten stick out, the correct welding technique, as well as tack welding. We cover achieving correct gas gas flow and knowing when you've got that right. How to prevent heat distortion, we cover purge welding, using a gas lens, pulse welding, fusion welding, and then destructive testing, just to make sure that you're confident that you have got sufficient penetration into your part and you know that that part is going to be fit for purpose. We then cover some of the material specific welding skills, covering mild steel, chromoly, aluminium, stainless steel, and even titanium. Now, there's a lot of information here, but really when it comes down to it, we can still apply a simple step-by-step process to TIG welding, and here we present the HPA 6-step process. This starts with part preparation, moves on to welder setup and welder settings, then we cover setting ourselves up, and this is something that's really often overlooked. You absolutely need to be comfortable and in the right position to have a good chance to lay down a really high quality weld. Step 5, of course, is welding, and then the final step, step 6, cooling our part down. As usual, this includes a library of worked examples, so you can actually watch that 6-step process being put to work on a variety of different welding jobs on a variety of different materials. So as I mentioned, this package deal, normally $299 US. Use the coupon code RILEY100, that is RILEY 100. That'll get you $100 off, bring it down to just $199 US. You can still break that payment down further at checkout into as many as 8 individual weekly payments. We're trying to make this as affordable as we can so we can help as many people out there learn the skills of motorsport fabrication. Of course, even using this coupon code, you are still protected with our 60-day, no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase and for any reason at all decide it's not what you expected, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes so it's nice and easy for you to find. And now let's get back to our interview with Riley. All right, I'm just interested, we'll get back to the actual build of the car. Obviously there's a lot of advantages with getting rid of the factory chassis and starting from scratch, building your own tube chassis. But with that freedom comes a lot of sort of difficult decisions that have got to be made in terms of where you're going to run each of the individual bars, making sure that, you know, for example, you haven't built yourself into a corner where it becomes a marathon effort to remove a gearbox or the engine and reinstall those components. I'm wondering sort of how did you go about planning this out? Were you using CAD? Were you doing it sort of just freestyle or something in between?
Yeah, so back when I built that car, it was definitely a lot of sitting there pondering, really trying to, comes back to that built in my head over and over again, trying to figure out, you know, running through visualizing in my head, okay, if I do this, then what? And if I put this here, then, you know, where does this go? And so a lot of it was manual back then. There wasn't a single piece of that car that was built, you know, on a computer back then. I didn't even know what CAD was, to be honest with you. So it was all, you know, reading what I could about chassis design and then about kinematics, suspension kinematics and geo, and being able to somewhat work backwards from that and try and know, okay, these things are not, these items X, Y, and Z, they have to be here. There's no two ways about it. I don't have a choice to a degree. So then you find all those places and then you work from there and ultimately, going that route, I think there's something beautiful about that in a creative sense and in an aesthetic sense, but there are inefficiencies. So a lot of that comes into like, okay, at the time I had no experience. And so there's a lot of things where I went back and there's, you know, this tube here and it's like, okay, well that's there. And what's going to be easier, me repackaging my fire system or moving that tube? It's like, you know, definitely repackaging the fire system, you know? And so a lot of that led to, you know, in total transparency, the car was heavier than I wanted and packaged further from the puller moment than I wanted and stuff like that. Now, I know that now, but then it was a beautiful thing to me. I loved the way it looked and even the way it was packaged. Although inefficient, it led to something that if you were to do it in software may not have turned out quite as pleasing to me at the time. And that probably leads into a whole conversation of redoing things.
Which we'll get to. In terms of the suspension, though, you sort of talked about kinematics, and again, this sort of comes back to what I was saying with the complete freedom with a tube chassis to put, you know, suspension pickup points essentially wherever you want. With so much flexibility, you can end up getting the suspension kinematics just monumentally wrong. What was the process of figuring out the suspension kinematics? I mean, first of all, what you actually wanted, your camber curve, for example, to be, and then the process of actually working out where you needed to get the mounts in order to achieve that goal.
Yeah, so at the time when I kind of got through that, I was working at ground control still. So I did bounce some ideas off of my boss, Jay. They're very smart guy. And he kind of gave me some basics to run with based off of all of his experience off production cars. So, like these cars, like say for instance, E46 M3s, they like X, Y, and Z as far as alignment. This is kind of how they go fast. So then I'm like working backwards from there and knowing kind of the basics of, well, my CG is going to be lower, and instead of using like a 5-link or something like that in the back, I'm using a standard upper and lower. And so kind of working through a lot of that based off the basics and then trying to research. It's actually probably the part of the car that took me the longest, because I sat and I read a couple books and read everything I could find online, whether it be on Optimum G or any website I could find in Google, basically, about the basics of what suspension needed to be. And I figured, if I can run the basics and get the basics right, and then leave adjustability in everything as far as being able to adjust roll center, being able to adjust caster, getting the caster very close for a starting point, and then also designing things so, like, for instance, like this, so the caster, so I can adjust it without messing with, too much with bump steer, so being able to slide the control arm straight back rather than having to rotate it like a typical, older body car, something like that. So I really basically went through and built it to this kind of your standardized answers as far as bump curves, camber curves, and your rear toe curve and stuff like that, throughout the travel with those in mind. And then I went, and so I had all that in mind, and then went and I actually used string physically to map out my control arms and all of the geometry so that I could cycle it and make sure that everything was actually measured out, like roll center wise, scrub, all that stuff actually measured out how I wanted before I placed my actual mounts on the chassis side. And then, like I said, made sure everything was adjustable, every aspect, which was a blessing. Thankfully, I got it right enough to where the car was able to go relatively quick without having to mess with it. But after doing it, realized there was so much adjustment in everything in every direction. If I hadn't set it up decent enough to begin with, I would have got lost in the sauce and ended up with some crazy, messed up alignment trying to adjust everything on it. So
I sort of see the benefit of providing a bunch of adjustability, but yeah, you can sort of get yourself so far out of the ballpark you can't see your way back with a massive amount of adjustability in every way, shape and form as well. One of the aspects of the car that's sort of a visual feature is the pushrod suspension actuation as well. So was that for a performance reason, or was it to make a visual impact?
Well, so it was performance based. It wasn't. So the benefits of it came after the fact. My initial reason for doing it was I was using off the shelf Coney shocks for mock-up, and I realized that because of the height of the front of the car and the ride height, the shock, I would have to run a tiny little, like 40 series, tiny little shock, and there was a decent chance it was going to be like basically up against the hood or the top of the fender, because I wanted to move the motion ratio out so far so I didn't end up with like a 0.5 to 1 MR on the thing. And so I realized that going pushrod actuated, I could modify all that. I could package a little bit bigger shock, and then I could also modify the motion ratio with the rocker. And so I realized that that's gonna be, although it's a little hard to package it and figure out the actual locations that work geometrically, it would be worthwhile to be able to modify my motion ratio with the rocker, and then also be able to corner balance and align the thing and adjust ride height without actually messing with bump stock packer and everything in the shock as well. So kind of being able to divorce those two things. And so that's kind of how I went about it. And then I originally, in the packaging in the car, couldn't run them straight across from one another. So I had to kind of turn them in the front. So ended up with a parallel to chassis, I guess transverse mounted or longitudinally mounted shock.
Okay. In terms of the engine combination, obviously another really big aspect of the car, and from what I sort of think I've read somewhere online, your aim at from the get-go was 10,000 RPM, 1,000 horsepower, and naturally aspirated. And it's that sort of that last component there, naturally aspirated, that becomes really problematic, because that's big numbers to get out of an NA engine, walk in the park for a supercharger or turbo. So yeah, why for a start those numbers? Do you just like round numbers, or what was the reasoning behind that?
So I guess this rewinds back to it being my kind of my Hail Mary, my last hurrah as far as a car for myself. And with that, horsepower and engines have been and still are probably my favorite part of a car, probably the favorite part of a lot of people, or cars to a lot of people. But for me, there's something about pushrod V8s. They're not, in my mind, when you think about all the pieces and the directions they're going, it shouldn't be able to do the things it does. It's just trying to murder itself all the time, right? And so I had a decent relationship with my engine builder from my 72 Chevy pickup, Don at Motor Machine. And I went into him with this car in mind and kind of told him, hey, I'm going to build this car. And I asked him for an experience. I asked him for more of a visceral request. I wanted big RPM, big compression, very snappy, very aggressive V8, small block. He came back, he's like, well, kind of sounds like what you like, or what you're trying to do is like some sort of like a pro stock motor, or rather an Australian pro stock motor, because they're not 500 inch, they're 400. It's like, okay. So I went back, did a little research, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. So, can we do that? I said, well, we can, yeah, but are you sure you want to? There's all of these things that go with it. And it's like, yeah, maintenance is fine. And he still, to this day, as recently as last week, you remember when I told you about all those things? You said you wanted to do it. And so we started down that path. And, he asked me about power a couple times, and it was more of like a back and forth of like, I don't know, what'll it make? What's a good goal? To be frank, I don't really care. It's going to make enough. And how hard do you want to spin it? Because there's a lot of decisions that come with, say for instance, an engine that spins 9,300 versus an engine that spins 10,000. There's a lot of decision making that go with that last 500 or 700 RPM.
Yeah. I think it's the RPM that's just so hard on just about everything, but particularly when you're running a pushrod valve train. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. And so, so we kind of had to set basics of like, what do you want? Because we have to build it backwards, right? If we initially build it for 9,200 and then you want to spin at 10, probably not going to work out great. So we kind of said, like, well, sitting there one day in the shop, like, I don't know, 1,000 and 10,000, sure, why not? Good goal. And so we went on with that being the thing. That was what we were trying to do. And when it came around to it, at the end of the day, we've spun it 10. I've accidentally spun it 10 390 a couple times, and it never actually even went on a engine dyno, because there was a kind of one of those things that got picked up, to be completely honest, got picked up by media and became the calling card of the car. But it was always a byproduct to me. I never really cared that much about that.
It's always nice to have an aim, but yeah, you got to have a bit of a plan when you're going into a build like this. And just like the RPM aim, obviously the components you're going to choose and the level of detail required to make 600 horsepower versus 800 versus 1,000, they're very different things. I assume it has, however, been on a chassis dyno. Are we allowed to know what it laid down at the res?
Yeah, it makes, so depending on the dyno, it's been on two different kinds. It makes last time it made between 790 and 810 to the tire.
It's not shabby. I'd be pretty happy with that.
Yeah, so and then that was through a 4-speed dog engagement gearbox and Winner's quick change independent center. So I don't know what to believe for drivetrain loss, and to be frank, I don't really care. It's way more power than I've ever really needed. So it's a lot.
Yeah. I think it always comes down to that. From running a tuning shop, you always got customers. Pretty much every second customer's asking, what does the power at the wheels relate to at the flow? I'm like, well, how long's a piece of string? I just don't have that number. And people throw around, drivetrain losses of 10 or 15, or even I've heard 25%. And I mean, if you've got something that's laying down 800 horsepower at the wheels, and you want to sort of claim 20% drivetrain loss, I mean, that's a lot of heat being put into the gearbox and the differential. I don't know how realistic that is. At the end of the day, I don't really care. I use the dyno as a tuning tool, and it's a comparative tool for me. And just like you mentioned there, take your car and put it on 5 different dynos, you're probably going to get 5 different results. So it's all about just, what did it start with? What did you finish with? And I mean, once as a tuner, you know your dyno, you kind of got a sense of, what is this particular combination? What should it actually be producing? And whether you're actually, in that ballpark. Now, one of the sort of standout features, at least when you first built the car, was the headers, which is a fairly intricate, complicated sort of spaghetti junction of an 8 into 1. Again, was this sort of more for the aesthetic aspect as opposed to performance, or is it sort of form follows function?
No, it was, and like I said before, in the beginning, I'm an open book. So it was actually due to poor planning. So when I built the car, going through kind of how I built it financially, I didn't have all the money to have everything for it. So I actually didn't have the engine in at the house until 9 days before it was finished. So I was working off of a blown up LS mock-up block with no cylinder heads and no intake, no oil system, no nothing. And so I kind of had to in my mind, kind of oh, well, headers are probably about this big. And I didn't have any room to get the exhaust out, and still don't, to get the exhaust out the driver's side of the car without doing a fender exit. There's just no room for anything next to the driver, essentially. And so getting down to the wire, realized I got to get exhaust out of this thing. And at the time, I knew it needed a big primary if we were going to even get close to that number, and all these things that I'm trying to hypothesize. For materials available at the time, they didn't have much for oval tubing, and also I'm not only materials, that's the first header I ever built. I hadn't built a set of headers yet. And so in my mind, I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. How am I going to get this out of this car? And start thinking, I'm like, okay, so if I go across the front, do I go out the front of the fenders, or, what's my move? And I didn't like that. And I knew I wanted to go out the passenger side of the car, out of the door or something like that, kind of reminiscent of nostalgic cars of the day. So I started thinking, and I know that Tanner Faust had his, I think it's a Passat maybe, but it had an 8-to-1 on it. It was the first one I had ever seen, and it sounded crazy. Like, well, if everything has to go to that side, I mean, that makes sense, right? It's got to go, all of them have to go to that side. I may as well just do an 8-to-1.
Yeah, why not?
So, yeah, so it's kind of, screw it. I'll just put them into one massive collector, and then I'll build this behemoth of a structure from this 5-inch exit on this 8-to-1 that goes super oval, and then I can stuff it out the door. Yeah, okay, let's do that. And so I built it, and it sounded really cool. I mean, it did all of the media stuff, right? And it was a huge hit, and understandably, it was this gargantuan mess of what is that on the front of the thing. Yeah, that's it. It was basically it was a means to an end. It was to get the exhaust out of the car. And that was in material choice, and then also, in transparency, in my novice exhaust building history, that was what I came up with.
It's a hell of a start to building your first header with a combination like that, but it obviously worked, and it definitely looks the part, so all power to you. Also probably worth just talking, a little bit outside of your sort of core skills, but ECU, what's the electronics package in it?
So these days it's a Motec M130. So Motec M130, PDM15, and C127. So a whole Motec package. That's what it runs these days. And I've got Oscar Zalea Brothers. He takes care of all the keyboard stuff on it.
Yeah, we've actually had him on the podcast quite a while back. Very smart guy.
Very smart, very good dude.
So once you actually got this thing to the racetrack, how did it all work out? Was it sort of just trouble-free motoring, or did you find out a whole bunch of problems that you couldn't have foreseen?
So somewhat interesting. So following finishing the car, I moved straight down, started business with a buddy, and the car, unfortunately, was a little bit of a casualty of that. So it took me a very long time to get it from first time running and driving, getting it on the dyno, to actually first time on the track. But during that time, I tinkered on a few things and was able to kind of get the mechanical side of things, what I thought was relatively sorted, and got out to the track for the first time, and it ran and was able to turn a few laps. But I had a couple weird oil pressure issues and few electrical issues, stuff of that nature, but nothing like crippling right off the bat. So tried to work through some of those, the oiling system probably being the most difficult as far as trying over and over and just kind of trying and failing to figure it out.
The engine was dry sump from the get-go?
Yeah. It was originally a 5-stage dry sump.
So where were the issues in the oiling system?
Yeah, so it was rather interesting actually. So it had the reason it took so long to figure it out was because it could run on the dyno and everything, and we did dyno pulls, good oil pressure, everything else. But I'd get out to the track, and 3 laps in, it would start to lose oil pressure to where it would only make 40 psi, right? And so
Yeah, that's not enough.
no, so in interest of like trying to get stuff sorted out, I'd basically drive it off the tack. So it's like, okay, I got 40 psi, so it's not going past 4,000 RPM. And that was the core of the problems for probably the first year. Now, the year being a year in calendar time, but it probably only went to the track 3 times in that year. And I'm working, trying to get a business going the rest of the time. And so I went round and round with that for quite some time. Oil pressure stuff, couldn't really figure it out. Talked to the manufacturer. We're both kind of scratching our head, him from his place and me from the shop. Ended up actually, the gentleman who helped me and got it solved was Carl Thompson, who I believe is from New Zealand.
He sure is.
Yeah, great dude. I'm fiddling with it one night, banging my head up against the wall, and post a picture or a story on Instagram or something. He's like, "Hey man, what's going on? What's your system? Explain it to me." So I did, and he's like, "All right, well, basically that's trash. Like, don't do that." And kind of walks me through the basics of what he's got going on his motors, which are relatively similar, and how he makes it work. And, a few things I went through and replumbed basically all the scavenge lines with spiral wound tubing so they're not sucking themselves shut. And then also the motor's sealed now. Originally, I had vents going from the valve covers to the tank and then supplying at the bottom of the tank. And so I think, whether it was one or the other, I don't know, but I think there's a combination of potentially sucking the lines shut on the scavenge lines once it got hot, and or one of the theories that we had was the vent line was only a 10, and it was vented to the top of the tank, and then the tank wasn't vented. So we're sucking on both sides of the engine. It's trying to pull oil out of the bottom, but then the pump's also trying to pull vacuum on the top of the tank. And so whichever it was, I followed his advice and plumbed it with the sizing and stuff that he recommended, and it's been incredible since.
Oh, it must have been very satisfying to get on top of that. I mean,
oh yeah,
obviously a dry sump system is not a small financial commitment, and you install it to prevent oil pressure issues. So to end up with the exact issue that you're trying to avoid is got to be pretty frustrating.
Yeah, it was frustrating, and it was also kind of one of those. The engine was probably the financial endeavor that I knew, like at the time, I was like, if I mess this up, there's no coming back. I'm like, if I pop this thing, it's dead for forever. I can't afford, they talk about don't build something you can't afford to rebuild. And I basically took that and threw it in the trash. I was like, I can't afford to do it once, but I'm gonna try. So, so yeah, it was a pretty stressful thing. And thanks to Carl, like it's been incredible since. Oiling system's been bang on.
Yeah. If people want to get a little bit more of an understanding of Carl Thompson as well, we've actually done a YouTube interview with him at SEMA, and we'll link to that just to give those who haven't heard the name before a bit of an understanding of the quality of his builds, because he builds some really, really nice cars. Now, with the amount of time and money poured into this build, the quality of the build, I mean, it is essentially show car standard. Do you have any hesitations about actually driving the wheels off this thing on the racetrack?
I don't. Honestly, I the whole time I was building the car, I told myself, like, it doesn't matter how much I end up in it or how much I don't want to hurt it, because I'm pretty picky, like as far as in my normal like scratches and stuff. I don't like damage, but I told myself almost every day, like, you have to drive it. There's no point in doing all of this and then having it sit. Like, it could have a 10-to-1 compression small block Chevy in it if you're just going to leave it sit there. So I basically coached myself through that. Like, there's a very good chance it's going to get wrecked, and it's going to get damage, and it's going to get rubber and rock chips and beat to hell. So when it finally got finished, after repeating that rhetoric to myself over and over, it was a no-brainer, and it's been a no-brainer since. I've just got to do it.
I mean, it is nice to see a car of that caliber actually being used for its intended purpose. Looking at the project now, sort of anything that was glaringly wrong with the original build, or what's the evolution been since the original build was completed? I think I saw on your Instagram that maybe a month or two ago it was getting air jacks fitted to it. What are the changes been along the way?
Ooh. Well, I guess at this point, trying to think, I think at this point I've changed almost everything. The only part that actually is in the car that hasn't come out yet, especially in this recent, I'm actually going through another iteration at the moment, but is the fuel cell. Everything else has come out of the car. But I think one of the more first and most glaring problems that it probably had outside of weight, which is kind of there's ways to go around that. But one of the first things that actually needed sorting was the suspension rockers for the motion ratio. The car ended up considerably heavier than I wanted initially. And then pair that with also, you can measure out your motion ratio and everything on paper, but when you actually put it on the ground, pushrod angle and all of that starts to play into how much actually acts on the spring. So doing it old school way, jacking up the tire 1 inch at a time and measuring damper travel, the front motion ratio was 0.5 to 1 when I got done. So I had to have a crazy spring in the thing to keep it off the ground. So that was probably the first actual problem that needed to be remedied to drive the thing properly.
Sounds like that one would be a relatively easy fix, though. Just manufacture another rocket with a different ratio, correct?
Yep, exactly. So did that, and then the next problem it had as far as breaking things was the reason the 8-to-1 is now gone. Well, one of the reasons. The exhaust section that I made after the collector was this big oval monstrosity that went out the door. And stainless steel being in long flat sheets with exhaust pulses going through it doesn't last very long. So it kept cracking. I kept trying to fix it. And I think about the fourth time I fixed it, every time, so as part of my inexperience at the time, I couldn't get that section out without pulling the header off the car because it was trapped. And so the first time I had to fix it, I was pissed at myself. And the fourth time I was mad at myself and the header. And I decided this is not working. I'm going to change it. I'm redoing it.
I think until you've realized that you've built yourself into a corner with making something really, really difficult and time consuming to work on, it makes you really rethink the way you design things with that in mind, because it is such a frustration when you realize you've just got that wrong. And I mean, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but that was the situation I ended up in with my Evo. We tube framed the front end of it. I wasn't doing the fab work on it, but everything looked beautiful. And this was no disrespect to the fabricator. It was just a case of we didn't know what we didn't know. How it ended up was that to change the clutch, which I had to do after every 10 passes, it required obviously the gearbox to come off the engine. But the way the chassis was designed, you couldn't remove the gearbox independent of the engine. So a clutch job all of a sudden became about 10 hours worth of work. I mean, that's just, yeah. And I cursed myself every time I was doing a clutch on that car. It was just such a pain in the ass.
Yeah, there's definitely there's a whole slew of those types of things that came from it being my first tube chassis. Also, that exact issue that you just mentioned, my car has had for its whole life up until this current redo. And pulling an engine out to change a clutch is one of the most frustrating, annoying, I've got to do this right now, and I got to do all this other stuff to do it, and that's so annoying.
Yeah, really makes you sort of rethink your life choices when you're in that situation.
Yeah, and it's a result of obviously my first tube chassis, and then also not understanding, going back to my engine builder, all those things you're going to have to do. You sure you want to do them? So inexperience.
Seems like a great idea at the time.
Yeah, inexperience in that sense, and then also the way the car was built was a little bit of a shotgun, wedding kind of situation. It got down to the wire and it was like, it's got to get done. And so contrast to how things are done now, like in the shop, for instance, in the shop, if I build something for a customer, there's a very good chance I've had it in and out of the car 10 times by the time the customer actually gets it, because that's the process in which most things are built, especially when they're built by hand. And so those are avoided now. And had I known that back then, and had I had the time and resources to do it, I guess, properly, it wouldn't be sitting on the frame table all cut apart right now.
And I think these builds to this level always are a bit of an evolution. I mean, I guess, not that I've ever had the opportunity to do this, I guess that building the car entirely in CAD before you fabricate a single component would probably help with understanding of, layout options and probably avoid some of these pitfalls. But I honestly think every car like yours, you're probably the owner or the person who's done the fab work, looking back on it after they've actually experienced working on it, would probably make some changes. I don't think you can get around it. That's that fair?
Yeah, I don't. So the CAD thing's an interesting way to go about it, concept, if you will. Not that it's not a concept. A lot of people do it, but kind of a thought exercise that I struggle with here in the shop. I've got a couple cars in the shop that are probably candidates for that, but it requires a couple of things that maybe are a little less practical. One of which is being knowing every part that has to go in the car prior to, which is difficult from a builder standpoint, but it's also difficult from a customer standpoint, because that means that you have to have a very, very large stack of cash ready to go, which is just not quite a reality for a lot of people, and you can't deviate once you commit to it. And then second to that is there are a lot of guys, Dimitri at BVI and Matt, M26 Engineering, a lot of those guys that are phenomenal at CAD work and building whole assemblies. But I think they'd probably agree, maybe I guess I shouldn't speak for them, but I could foresee a situation in the future to where you build something and you actually, since you don't actually have to physically get the gearbox or something out of the car yet, maybe there's a couple little things that it hangs up on that, had it been built manually on a table, you would know prior to all the stuff getting laser cut and bent and everything else. So I think there's possibilities for, I guess the reality is just in fabrication, there's no sure thing. You got to make sure you got the grinder handy.
All right. We're about an hour 45 into this, and we haven't really talked much about RS Motorsport. So I think we probably need to do this. So this obviously came off the back of this car build. Talk me through the sort of challenges associated with starting a fabrication business.
Outside of the obvious of your skill set and stuff like that, you got to be able to, you got to have the skills to pay the bills, as they say. But so outside of that is, getting work in the door. That's something that even to this day, I wake up pretty much every morning with that on my mind. Is, there's no retirement set up. There's no tenure. There's none of that. So I have to make sure that whatever I'm doing is of the quality, and the way I conduct myself in the business side of things yields a long career. And so with that, it's getting customers in the door. So whether that be with marketing, for me, I'm admittedly really, really bad at social media, which is probably the cornerstone of marketing these days. It's a very difficult thing for me. I argue with myself about it all the time. Whether it be your marketing or your customers to get word of mouth, which is thankfully to my customers, that's most of how I subsist, is word of mouth. Making sure that you set expectations and you do right by them and you do exactly what you're going to say, if not more, to make sure that everybody's happy. And that's part of it. And I won't say it's a struggle, because I enjoy that part of it, but it is something that is on my mind constantly, is how to keep this train going. Past that, I guess, you've got obviously the scalability of a business. Mine at the moment is me. So there's managing expectations and managing a schedule, which for me, the schedule is purely this shop. And thankfully to my lovely girlfriend, that's all I really have to worry about. And she's not, demanding of me, being home at a normal hour. So that's another struggle.
I'm interested, the usual sort of challenges when someone starts an automotive performance-based business. They're going to do this because they're good at a particular aspect, maybe tuning like I was, or in your case, obviously fabrication. And then you get to the point of actually running this business, and you quickly realize that you can only spend maybe half of your day actually doing the thing that you love and that you're good at. And then there's all the other stuff that maybe you don't love quite so much, which is actually running the business, which is, of course, just as important. Answering emails, answering the phone when customers call, quoting work, getting parts, and all of the other sort of non-glamorous aspects of running a business. I'm just wondering how you sort of found that, how balancing that worked for you.
Yeah, so one of the good things about being, one-man band by myself is the turnover. I don't have 6 guys here. The good and bad of that. The bad being I can't book 50 jobs this year. The good of it being that everything has to go through me. So I'm acutely aware of what I have on my calendar and etc. And with that's a smaller customer base. So it's a little more intimate. So every one of my customers has my cell phone number. And, a lot of them I'm thankful to say have turned into friends of mine over the years. So with that, like you said, a lot of the day is not spent doing exactly what it is that you love doing and why you started. When you're talking billable hours versus hours spent at the shop, it's 60% at best, to where it's, every day I get here at between 7 and 8 in the morning. And I'm usually not like in the zone, headphones in, banging on whatever I'm supposed to be working on that day till at least noon. Because in the mornings, you got customers that want, answers about whatever. You got to update customers, go through emails, make sure parts are ordered, all of those kinds of things, which is, like you said, no one really talks about that stuff. And when I started, no one told me. So, you get into it and you're like,
it's a bit of a rude wake up call when you realize how much actually goes into operating a business.
Right. And then, with that, obviously the finances of it are a difficult thing to wrap your head around, because you get into this gig and everybody sees shop rates, right? Say for simple, easy round math, $100 an hour. And they're like, man, you must be killing it. Because if you work 40 hours a week and there's 4 weeks in a month, and they do the simple math, and you're like, yeah, but that's real math. Shop math's funny math. It's not how shop math really works, unfortunately, because I'm not billing my customer for sitting on the computer ordering his, blow off valve and his tubing and whatever, and then while I'm doing that, I get a phone call from a different customer who wants to know if we can do X, Y, or Z. And then, my order that I put in, I just got an email from the rep and he let me know that this piece and this piece are out of stock. So they're going to ship them from Pennsylvania. And it's going to take 4 days. And so by the time you look up, you're like, it's been an hour and 15 minutes. And
you can't charge that to anyone.
I can't charge it to anybody. But the overhead for the building's still running.
Mm. Yeah, I think people also are very quick to forget about those overheads, the rent, the insurance, the power, all of the outgoings that are real easy to sort of sweep under the rug, but those are real expenses and really eat away at what you're actually taking home at the end of the day.
Yeah. So that was a learning curve for me, and definitely an adjustment period, and trying to figure out how to make that work and how to be fair to the customer but also fair to myself. How do you balance that? So that took some time.
One of the challenges that I really struggled with my old shop was how to price the work. And I'm interested to sort of get your experience on this. So the reason being, we were seldom doing the same job twice. And that's the problem with all of this sort of one-off custom work. And sometimes it's literally impossible, because you don't know until you get into the job exactly what you're going to be dealing with. And I found it really hard to sort of meet the customer's expectations, give fair pricing. And what I often found, we're in a situation of, spending 40 hours working on a car, and you look at the bill at the end of the day and you maybe compare that to where you'd sort of estimated with the customer, and you're like, oh, there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to charge all of this. So you sort of end up working 40 hours and, I don't know, charging 30 of them, which makes your hourly rate look obviously much less attractive. So I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, so it really depends. So, being a lot of what I do are, like you said, nothing's the same. I don't do the same thing hardly ever. There's different chassis. And as time goes on, I've realized I'm not going to see the older chassis that I thought I was going to do a bunch of, because, an E36 now is 30 years old. So I'm not going to see those very much as track cars. Now I'm seeing E92s, F80s, stuff like that. And then you have different makes, so I don't see a lot of the same thing. And I guess, so that's where, in my opinion, the professionalism comes in. So like on a cage, I know roughly roundabout where I'm going to be. Certain cars, whether it's an aluminum chassis car, steel chassis car, convertible, slick top, sunroof car, because they all have, while they are different chassis, they all have different little isms about them that are going to contribute or take away from cost. I know about how much tubing is going to go into each of them just based off the size of the car. Same with turbo kits. I do my research and my homework with the customer. And then also, if I haven't seen that car ever before, through searching online, looking at photos, trying to figure out what it is it's going to take before I do send off, an estimate. And then prior to that, I do usually, if it's something I'm not very sure of, have a conversation with the customer of, hey, this is an estimate. This is as close as I can get. And I do promise I'm going to do my best to keep it to that. And I will let you know along the way if we're going to deviate. Like if I get in there and I see something that's like, that's going to be a nightmare and I can do it, but it's going to take X, Y, and Z. I'll have that conversation with you and we can decide where to go from there. But that's the only way that I've found to make it fair for all parties is I'm not trying to tie you to a bill.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think the other thing as well is our industry is tainted by, maybe some players that are actually genuinely ripping the customers off or just literally couldn't quote their way out of a paper bag. And that sort of sets an expectation for the customer. So I think, my opinion was always that communication with the customer and keeping them in the loop was the most important thing. No one wants to sort of get an estimate for a $4,000 job, absolutely zero communication until the day the car's ready to pick up and here's your car. And oh, by the way, it's actually $8,000 now, not $4,000. That does leave a sort of a bit of taste in the customer's mouth, I think.
Yeah. And it is unfortunate, like you said, there's for every car I've had in the shop, there's two stories of nightmare encounters somewhere in someone's past, in that car's past, in the history of the owner, what have you, with another shop that screwed him over, ripped him off, and they had to kind of pay to get their car out of impound kind of deal. Like you said, communication's the biggest thing for me, and just making sure it's one of the beauties of one man shop, one man band, is I know what's going on with all of the cars because I'm the one doing it. And I try to keep a very personable relationship with everybody because at the end of the day, while I'm selling a service, I'm also the one doing it. You came here and you dealt with me. And so I'm the one responsible, right? I'm responsible for the work. I'm responsible for the communication you get. And I'm responsible for the overall experience and how your gut feels about the person, and so I think that's important. So I try to keep that in mind.
One of the concerns I'd have as a one-man band is obviously there's a limited scalability with business. You've got however many hours you're prepared to work in the week, and as we've already talked about, maybe 60% of those hours are actually billable to a customer. So that's kind of your glass ceiling, I guess, in terms of your income. Are you considering expanding, bringing in some more staff?
Yeah. I've it's along there with how do I keep customers coming through the door for the next 30 years is how do I make it 30 years? At the moment, I work all hours of all the days. Here 7 days a week, usually until the double-digit hours at night, and thankfully I love it. But I know that when I'm 45, 50 years old, probably not going to love that so much. Probably not going to be able to physically do it so much either. So with that, the question of moving into some parts, making some parts that I think are genuine to me and to what I like and what I believe parts should be, whether that be, I made a little steering hub adapter with Dimitri. It's like a little part, stuff like that. Or if it's bringing on help. And I'm open to both ideas, and I have actively made little steps in each direction. But one of them, bringing on people, kind of circles back around to that conversation of the customer and being fair to the customer. And one of the struggles that I fight is, one, being able to give the customer what I promised them with someone else's work and the auditing of that. And then the second being able to afford that person that can do that work. Like you said, the hours in the day and billable hours and income, it's a hard ask, because it's hard work a lot of the time. And so you have to find the right person. And while I'm sure that person is out there, someone highly skilled, highly hungry that wants to do this, I'm sure they're out there. It is a difficult person to find. And I don't want to run the shop that just has a set of hands and a warm body to do busy work, because that's not, in my opinion, fair to that employee. And also, I don't know that it's fair to my customer to, when they signed up for something that I may be known for or what have you, and they get something built by somebody else that's maybe not that quality. I don't ever want to be that shop.
No, I think you've really got to protect your name and your reputation. And as soon as you start bringing on staff, you do lose. You're always going to lose a little bit of the control, because you just aren't the one person touching everything anymore. So choosing that right person, I think, is really the key there. I know from my background, every time I employed a new staff member at my old tuning shop, I had a bit of anxiety. It's like it was just always a little bit uncomfortable in terms of, am I going to be able to actually make money off this person? Are we going to be able to keep them busy? I mean, every time it worked out, but I kind of think if you're not just a little bit uncomfortable about a new hire, then something's probably wrong. I think that being a little uncomfortable makes you a bit more cautious about employing the right person, doing the proper checks, making sure they're going to be a good fit. I think the other thing that was important for my old business, and just as important now at HPA, is the fit of the staff member with everyone else. I mean, obviously at the moment just yourself, but it's very easy to get a wrong hire, and it just becomes a toxic environment, and it just automatically destroys the culture that you've built up. So really, really critical. In some ways, maybe not with fabrication, but in some ways I think with HPA, the fit with the culture of HPA for our staff members is almost probably more important than their outright skills. Obviously, we're not employing dummies, but you can learn the skills, but you can't learn culture, I think.
Yep. And that's one of those things that I've battled with this. I've talked to a lot of people about it. And one of the things is that I struggle to wrap my head around is when we're doing these things, especially since not everything's automated, most all of it's done with hands. There's a certain level of craftsmanship. And then with that is to be able to provide the type of service that I do, which would be that person's job to a degree, right? With some coaching, of course, but part of the reason I think the things that I do turn out the way they do is because this is my whole everything. This is my life. All the inspiration that I draw for every part I make is because this is literally all I do. I don't work at 3:00 in the afternoon wishing that I was home to watch something on TV or go golf or do another hobby. When I'm working on a car, whether it be building a flat floor for a car or, roll cage or what have you, any of the things in the shop, the inspiration and the creativity on where you're going to land a tube, where you're going to route this, how it's going to look and how it's going to function is all based, because this is, even when I close off, say I shut down at 7:00, I'm turning around to my car and trying to do the same thing. And so with that comes a certain level of creativity and a certain aesthetic and a certain practicality that goes with each piece that's made, that I think even if someone's like, because there's a lot of people that can weld better than me. There's a lot of people that can fit tube better than me. There's people that are better than every aspect of what I do than I do. What I'd like to think is that because I am utterly obsessed with it, I try to put them all together as well as I can. And that drawing on inspiration, because it's my whole life, maybe yields a product that's maybe just a little different, that might be desirable to some people, other people that maybe, even though someone could weld it better, but it won't quite look like that or work like that.
Yeah, and I think fabrication does sort of lend itself to a creative mind, because there's 10 different ways you could achieve an outcome that will function properly. But, you can also do it in a way that has a certain aesthetic that meets your own sort of preference. And I think that's the creative side of fabrication that's so unique. I'm just interested in some of the newer technologies that have popped up. I mean, probably really not that new anymore, but I mean, as we're talking here, so it's a podcast, but I can see that you've got a bamboo 3D printer sitting beside you. Obviously, the advent of CAD and 3D scanning as well, these have become prevalent in the motorsport industry and in fabrication. I was wondering if you're leveraging any of that sort of technology.
Yeah, I am. And again, in transparency, more recent than historically. I am pretty much always behind the curve of technology, media, all of it. I don't know what it is about me. I'm late to everything. But yes, I am, and I'm doing my damnedest to learn. So I'm no CAD aficionado, but I do own a 3D scanner. I actually acquired that this last year, the Peel, or actually beginning of this year, Peel CAD. And then, I've got the Bamboo. I work in Fusion, and there's a lot of things that it's opened up, not only just the ability to design something in 3D space before, whether it's a little bracket for something, or the most recent was I designed an intake lid for my motor that houses a drive-by-wire motor, the throttle body, and the big sprint car airbox. So I was able to design all that. I was able to test one that I 3D printed in the printer, and now it can go off and get CNC'd. So that, all the way from something like that, all the way to, for instance, scanning the whole chassis of my car and being able to employ someone else to do certain aspects of things for me that are better than me at it. So my uprights on my car, Dimitri over at BBI, he was able to take my parts, scan them, design them, and they showed up at the door, ready to bolt onto the car. And so using technology, not only here in the shop physically by myself, but also being able to scan something like my chassis, scan my whole chassis and everything, and then send all of the data and all the mesh of all of the pieces to a suspension engineer in a different country so that he can run through the geo and kinematics to one, as much as I think the car worked great before in its previous iteration, could always be better, right? And so employ an actual suspension engineer to go through and work on some of that for me. So, which is multifaceted. Not only is he probably more knowledgeable, he's done this a lot, he's way more knowledgeable than I am on that front as far as the geo. I can fab it, and while he's working through all the kinematics and all of the iterations, I can be in the shop turning out customer work. And so in that sense, there's that benefit as well that I found really enriching, being able to do that stuff, so that's great.
I think for me as well, when we talk about CAD, people are probably thinking about what we've talked about already, designing the entire car in CAD. But I mean, there's also much simpler aspects with using Fusion that I wish I had access to this back when I had my shop. Particularly what I'm talking about here is the sheet metal working tools that Fusion offers, and be able to design brackets and tabs, and then just literally send a file to a company like Send Cut Send, and then the parts turn back up, rather than the old-fashioned way of making maybe a cardboard template, fitting that up on the component. Does that fit? I might need a little bit more material here, and then finally you're hand cutting a part out of sheet metal. Very, very time consuming doing that, obviously very difficult to repeat, and it's just such a waste of time versus using these tools. Is that something that you're leveraging now?
Yeah. So I do a fair bit of that. It's rather interesting. So one of the things that I found is, like, I started fabricating, I didn't have hardly any tools, as far as, no fancy stuff, didn't have CAD, didn't have any software. So for the first, 3 years of building stuff, everything was by hand. And so I'm fairly quick at making templates. So my first thing that I started doing was, like, I would make a template with some chipboard or some construction paper. I'd whip up a template like immediately, and then I'd just put it in my scanner next to the computer and scan the thing into Fusion, outline it, basically just draw on the lines, and then send it off and get it cut. Because the cutting it and fiddling with pockets on this little tiny little bracket's what takes forever. So doing a lot of that, and then also parts that aren't available. Like, one of the last little things that I think I had Send Cut Send do was a couple of, so like the heads on my motor, the cylinder heads, the exhaust ports, like an odd, it doesn't exist, the bolt pattern and stuff. So I can't get gaskets. So I've been running just ultra copper, which is pretty common, but it's very messy. So I was like, well, you know what? I'll just draw this. So I just drew the flange, and I just had Send Cut Send do little copper gaskets.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Simple stuff like that it just makes very, very simple and very straightforward. And I drew it in, a minute and a half on my lunch, and then sent it off, and they showed up, a week later or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the alternative, how long that would take you to actually cut that gasket out of copper by hand. It's going to be hugely time consuming.
That's why I had ultra copper RTV on it.
Yeah. Plus, then you've got the benefit as well, as if you need another set of gaskets down the line, is just as easy as ordering.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
All right, Riley, look, I could honestly talk probably for another hour, but I do want to respect your time. You've been very generous with it so far, so I think we'll move towards wrapping this up. And we've always got the same three questions, of course, we ask all of our guests. The first of those questions is, what's next in the future for you? I guess maybe we've touched on a little bit of that with maybe bringing on more staff in the future, but yeah, anything else you want to add to that?
I mean, I'll be here in the shop. I've got a number of cars in here, customer cars in here that I'm working on that are very exciting, that I'll be chipping away at. So I'll be doing that, and yeah, trying to look at scaling the shop. Whether that be an employee or maybe I'll come up with some $1 million idea. I don't know, but no, I'll be here in the shop, just grinding away. I do really enjoy the work, so I don't have a problem with that. And maybe at some point, the right person, I run into the right person, I can bring them on and be merrier than ever, and happy couple here banging away in the shop.
Yeah. All right, next question. Is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster? Maybe no pro BMXing?
Yeah. I mean, start a little earlier. These days everybody's starting everything so early. I thought I had to jump on it at like 25, 26, but apparently, these days I feel old. I'm 32. I feel old. So, start as early as you can. And another one of those things that I've thought about is being realistic and true to yourself as far as what you want and not being afraid to go get it. That's one of those things, you fight societal norms and everything else. You really just need to figure out what it is that you want, search deep inside yourself. There's so many distractions and so much noise these days. It's a hard thing to find what you actually truly want.
Yeah, I agree, actually. And I think the other thing is that also may evolve over time as well.
Right. Yeah. So keeping tabs on yourself, on what you want and not being afraid to just go full bore at it. One of the things I said a while ago, I remember I told my parents about it, was like, I think in order to be successful, I needed to allow, and I can't say for everybody, but I think you need to allow yourself to be consumed by whatever it is that you want to do. And I allowed myself to be consumed by this, and there's a lot of people way more successful than me, but it's gotten me this far.
Yeah. I think if you're not, as you put it, consumed by it, you probably are not going to commit enough to really see true success.
Right. There's a lot of trials along the way that it takes being committed and consumed by it to get through. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of points at which you go, this is way too hard for not enough reward. So the reward has to be just, I want to succeed at this, and that's the only thing I care about.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels I see with the story you've told us today, which sort of parallel my experience when I started my workshop. But I mean, things do change. Your priorities do change. Obviously, I'm a little bit older than you. I've got a couple of kids now as well. So now, sort of, I don't want to be working 80-hour weeks in the shop, 7 days a week. But at the time, that was my life, and I was committed to it, and that was the only way I could go drag racing. So that was what I loved to do. Didn't have to worry about kids. Didn't have a wife. So it all worked quite nicely at the time. But yeah, as I say, things kind of evolve, and I think that's natural as well. All right, last question for today. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so? What are your social media accounts?
Let's see. I think my Instagram is Riley, RILEY _ RS Motorsport. Pretty sure.
We'll chuck that in the show notes anyway. Okay. So
so
if you've got that wrong, we'll correct you. Make it easy for people to find.
Yeah. So that's my Instagram. It's kind of the only thing I really update, and even that, I'll be honest, a little shoddy, but I do check it. So, direct messages and stuff like that, I do.
That's the best place for people to reach out if they're maybe in the market for some fab work.
Yeah, that or email, which my email is on my website, rsmotorsportusa.com. So that's, email is just as good. It all comes to the phone these days. So either of those is totally fine. And then, honestly, a couple of messages in, you're going to get my phone number, because that's even better. So, yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I really appreciate everything you've sort of gone through with us today. It's been great to get some perspective into your backstory, particularly the deviation with the professional BMX racing. I did not know that and did not expect that. So it's a very unique story, but great to see the success that you've had to date. And we wish you all the best for the future.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for sharing it.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Riley, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Grant from Florida, who's said, finally caught up on the full back catalogue of episodes. It's crazy how much information is included in here for free. Well, great to hear that you're finding value in the podcast. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get 75 $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.